The highest deficit we ran pre-COVID was in 2004 at full employment. Highest deficit was 4%. So we're running a much higher level of deficits. And it's three main programs: unspent ARPA money, Inflation Reduction Act projects, Infrastructure Act projects. They're going on all over the United States, and I see them everywhere, and they're increasing the demand for workers. Goods and services, but particularly workers. This is why the employment market is so strong, is you've got this government-generated demand for workers. I think it is somewhat artificial, and I think when the government money starts to peter out, you'll see how artificial this is in hindsight.
When does that happen?
Well, the ARPA money is just now starting to peter out. This is the last year where the money has to be obligated and spent by 25. But you've still got the Inflation Reduction Act projects and Infrastructure Act projects going strong. For my money, I would love to see a whole of government approach to fighting inflation and have the federal government realize that if we're going to make inflation fighting a priority and help 60 million low, moderate income workers make ends meet, we ought to slow down implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act projects, not cancel, but slow, and let's wrestle this inflation issue to the ground so working class families can better make ends meet, and the Fed can begin to start taking their foot off the interest rate. But they can't do it yet with this fiscal spigot, in my opinion.
All right, guys, so we got to talk about this pretty wild clip from this documentary called Finding the Money. And this clip features one of Biden's top economic advisors, Mr. Jared Bernstein. And I think that it is worth noting that this guy graduated from Columbia University, right? So understand that this person graduated from an Ivy League institution, okay, while you watch this clip that, quite honestly, I can't believe is real, okay? I thought it was AI when I heard a top advisor in the Biden administration struggle to explain modern monetary theory, which is essentially just left-wing economics, Bidenomics. It is the reason why we are experiencing the inflation that we are experiencing right now, because modern monetary theorists underestimate the impact on inflation that happens when you have excessive money printing and government deficits, right? We're learning the hard way now. But despite all that, you do have this documentary, again, called Finding the Money, that essentially is promoting modern monetary theory and this idea that, hey, the government does not actually really need to borrow money when we can print our own money out of thin air. And essentially, they're trying to make the case for it by playing this clip of Biden's economic advisors struggling to explain why the U.S. government needs to borrow money when we could just print money out of thin air. Take a look.
The U.S. government can't go bankrupt because we can print our own money.
It obviously begs the question, why exactly are we borrowing in a currency that we print ourselves? I'm waiting for someone to stand up and say, why do we borrow our own currency in the first place?
Like you said, they print the dollar. So why does the government even borrow?
Well, again, some of this stuff gets, some of the language that some of the language and concepts are just confusing. I mean, the government definitely prints money, and it definitely lends that money, which is why the government definitely prints money, and then it lends that money by selling bonds. Is that what they do? They sell bonds. Yeah, they sell bonds, right? Because they sell bonds and people buy the bonds and lend them the money. Yeah. So a lot of times, at least to my ear with MMT, the language and the concepts can be kind of unnecessarily confusing, but there is no question that the government prints money and then it uses that money to I guess I can't really talk. I don't get it. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, because it's like the government clearly prints money. It does it all the time, and it clearly borrows. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debt and deficit conversation. So I don't think there's anything confusing there.
Wow, that's probably one of the wildest clips I've ever seen. Now, I'm pretty sure that that clip is probably cut up in a way to make this guy seem like a complete and total idiot. At the very least confused about how to explain modern monetary theory and the question of, okay, why does the federal government have to borrow money if we could just print our own currency, which is something that a Biden economic advisor, right? An economic advisor to the president should be able to explain. Now, I don't expect the average person to be able to explain it, okay? Because it is relatively complex and it can be confusing to understand, given this guy seems to be confused about how to actually explain it. But again, you see that we really don't have the brightest individuals running the government, okay? Or advising the people that are running the government, which is why you have Democrats passing bills that are called the Inflation Reduction Act that actually are contributing to inflation, okay? But you guys need to understand the simple answer to this question, right? In regards to, well, why does the government need to borrow money in order to finance his operations if the government can just print his own money? Well, again, the simple answer really is because this is the most effective way for the government to manage the economy and to reduce the chances of inflation, okay? Because when the government borrows money, aka they spend more money than they raise in tax revenues, the way that we manage the money supply is through the operations of the Federal Reserve. So if the United States government needs money to finance activities like, for example, economic stimulus or fighting some war, they have to issue Treasury securities, okay? And Treasury securities, there are a lot of them, right, that you can invest in with various interest rates and returns that are attractive for investors because investors want to put money into government securities. They want to give the United States government money because it is seen as the safest investment that you can make. Now, does that mean that it is 100% risk-free? No, but it is basically the most risk-free investment that you can have, okay? So it's considered extremely safe because it is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, right? Now, what is these dollars backed by outside of the U.S. government? Well, nothing, okay, which is why it's called fiat currency, okay? And in order to understand modern monetary theory, you actually really have to understand what fiat currency is. Fiat currency is essentially government currency that's not backed by anything. Now, in the 1970s, Nixon decided to basically take the dollar off the gold standard, and after that, a few years later, we decided to convince Saudi Arabia to sell oil in dollars in exchange for protection from the U.S. military. And effectively, this created the petrodollar system, which really underpins the reason why the world depends on the dollar, which is part of the reason why we can borrow so much money is because people actually need to use the dollar, okay? You have to use the dollar in order to buy liquid gold, right? Which is oil, okay? Oil is what we use for basically everything. We use it to power the world, to power our economy, and you have to buy that in dollars, okay? And as long as the dollar is useful to buy things, as long as people desire and demand dollars, then that is what upholds the full faith and credit of the United States government, which allows us to borrow so much money from international investors, domestic investors, etc. And it must be noted that this is also why our foreign policy is the way it is because mostly we're trying to maintain dominance of the dollar on the world stage, okay? This is why we spend so much on the military because military spending protection is currency in and of itself. Again, I just told you guys that one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia agrees to sell oil in dollars is because of U.S. military protection, okay? When we have the strongest, most powerful military in the world, essentially that strengthens confidence in the dollar, okay? And this idea that the U.S. government is stable, that the dollar is a stable asset to invest in. The reason why the government borrows money instead of just printing money is, again, because it is a better way of controlling inflation. If a government just decides that, hey, we're just going to print money, okay, instead of borrowing money, then that runs the risk of the money supply getting out of control, and it takes the ability for the government to control the amount of money circulating in an economy. It removes their ability to manage it effectively. And again, this is how you get hyperinflation, okay? But the United States government does a combination of both through the activities of the Federal Reserve and the federal government, okay, through a combination of monetary and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy being the policy of the U.S. government when it comes to spending, okay? So, for example, we need to spend $1 trillion to finance, a stimulus. What'll happen is that the government say, okay, well, we don't have the money. Therefore, we have to do deficit spending. We have to spend money that we don't have. The way that we get the money is to, again, borrow money from international investors, domestic investors, or maybe even the Federal Reserve. Okay, so the government will borrow that money, creating a deficit, and then spend that money in order to stimulate the economy. Now, when there's too much money chasing too few goods and services, what happens is that you have inflation, okay? Because you don't have enough goods and services to meet the demand that has been artificially created by the government. Now, what happens is that the government can try to control inflation and the economy through various ways, okay? Taxation being one of the means that the government has from a fiscal perspective to try to control inflation. Again, this is why we pay taxes, even though the government can just print money. But again, the government chooses not to just print money, okay? They choose to borrow money instead and to tax people because, again, it creates a need and demand for dollars, okay? If you have to pay taxes in dollars, then you need dollars in order to do so, right? So you keep that demand. It makes the currency a valuable thing to have because, again, you have to use that money in order to pay the government back, and the government has to use that money in order to pay its investors back that allow the government to borrow money in the first place, okay? And that's just one means, fiscal means, of how the government can try to influence the economy and inflation. Now, the other side of that is called monetary policy, which is the operations of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is responsible for maintaining the money supply, okay? So they are the ones that actually authorize the printing, okay? Even though the government, the U.S. government, prints the money, it is the Federal Reserve, aka the central bank, that is responsible for controlling the money supply and distributing the dollars, okay? So the Federal Reserve can influence inflation, okay, or influence the economy through what we call open market operations. So they can buy and sell Treasury securities, aka U.S. debt, on the open market in order to influence the money supply through what we call quantitative easing, which again is the Federal Reserve essentially buying U.S. debt securities in order to help finance government operations, or through quantitative tightening, which the Federal Reserve is essentially selling U.S. securities in order to suck money out of the economy or allowing them to mature. And this is just an overly simplified layman's explanation of why the government borrows money instead of just printing money into perpetuity. Well, the reason why is to help manage the economy better and to prevent mass inflation that would happen if you just printed money without the government borrowing the money, right? You would just increase the money supply. It would be very hard to control the amount of money in circulation and to inject money into the economy and pull it out of the economy like we currently do without the federal government borrowing money, okay? I mean, a lot of our operations in regards to how we manage the economy is through U.S. treasuries, which is debt issued by the U.S. government. The Federal Reserve buying and selling these treasuries in the open market, again, is how we inject and take money out of the economy. Now, this is how the Biden administration has justified this unlimited deficit spending, is because the idea from a modern monetary theorist perspective or a liberal economist perspective is that, well, the government can spend an unlimited amount of money and therefore deficits don't matter, okay? They want to essentially use fiscal policy as the primary means for controlling the economy and inflation. Like, they want to basically say, hey, you know what? We can spend an unlimited amount of money. We don't need to worry about any deficit, okay? We don't need to borrow it. Just print the money. And if inflation's out of control, then we just tax it, right? We just tax it, and that's how we control inflation. Now, again, this is why they call it the magic money tree theory, because that's essentially what it is, okay? That we could just print money out of thin air as if that produces real economic output. But again, we all know that the government is inefficient and not good at allocating resources and capital, which is why I think this theory kind of falls apart when you rely on the government or overly rely on the government to control the economy. Essentially, this is like communism. This is why Bernie Sanders and AOC love this theory, because essentially it doesn't have any restraints on what the government can spend money on as long as they believe that it's not going to increase inflation. But again, who's the determinant of that, right? Who is the determinant of how much money the economy can handle, right? The economic capacity of an economy. Who determines that, right? That's a very hard thing to measure, evidenced by what happened during the pandemic, in which you had the government spend trillions of dollars, and then guess what, right? Our economy couldn't handle it. You overheated it. You had too many dollars chasing too few resources, and now all of a sudden you have massive inflation, which is what happened. Now, again, Bernie Sanders, the AOCs of the world, they wanted to spend $10 trillion. Imagine what inflation would be like if we would have spent $10 trillion. We'd be in a Venezuela situation, right? But again, what we have here with the Biden administration is this focus on full employment, which is, again, what modern monetary theorists really, really, really want, is full employment. And they say, well, the government should spend as much money as possible in order to achieve that. And that is essentially what the Biden administration is doing. That is the policy that they have adopted. And that is, again, why you're seeing inflation be so persistent, because of government spending pushing pressure on wages to continue to rise as a result of demand for workers to do these government projects, which in turn create inflationary pressures, right? This is, again, part of the reason why we continue to see inflation as a result of some of the stimulus activities from the Biden administration, like the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill that was passed in Congress, okay? Because you have the government trying to control the economy too much through government spending instead of private investment, okay? Spending money that we really don't have in order to finance activities that may or may not actually equate to real economic output. And that in and of itself is, again, how you drive inflation, okay? And that is what we have going on right now, okay? The government spending too much money, and then now look at the inflation that we have. And we're struggling to get it under control because, again, the government, in my opinion, has limited power to actually control the economy, and the government trying to control the economy too much through unlimited spending in the long term can undermine the stability of the dollar and confidence in our currency, which, in my opinion, I think that is what essentially upholds this whole system in the first place, is that people have confidence in the dollar. Okay, people lose confidence in the dollar because the government is monetizing debt too much, or in a way that is extremely reckless, that can create instability and suboptimal economic outputs. Okay, this is why I don't trust the government to be the ones to determine how we should be spending our money. I believe the private sector should be the driving force of the economy rather than government spending. I think that is the ideal situation, that economic output is coming from the real economy, not the fake economy, the artificial economy propped up by fiat and government spending. So, that's my perspective on that. I just think that this liberal economists not being able to explain it or confused by it, despite the fact that this guy does this for a living and he's advising the Biden administration, tells you everything you need to know about why this administration is a disaster, because it is quite literally a clown show run by DEI hires who have no idea what they're doing, even though they're supposed to be experts in their field, but they can't even give you a basic explanation on their own policies, right? The policies that they're supposed to be advising our leaders on. Again, this government, the Biden administration, just continues to embarrass themselves every single day. And it doesn't seem to ever get better. So let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.